but the Aiel never seemed to understand why she hurried from the sweat tent whenever men came in. It would have fit right into Aiel humor if they had, but luckily they just did not make the connection, for which she was very glad. Gathering the rest of her clothes in her arms from the neat piles outside the sweat tent, she hurried back to her own. The sun was sitting low now, and after a light meal she was ready to fall asleep, too tired to even think of Tel'aran'rhiod. Too tired to remember most of her dreams either. That was something the Wise Ones had been teaching her, but most of those she did remember were about Gawyn. Chapter 25. Like Lightning and Rain. For some reason, when Coenda came to wake her in the grey before dawn, Egwene felt refreshed despite her dreams. Refreshed and ready to see what she could learn in the city. One long yawn and stretch and she was on her feet, humming as she washed and dressed hurriedly, hardly taking the time to brush her hair properly. She would have hurried away from the tents without wasting time on breakfast, but Cerelia saw her, and that put an abrupt end to that notion, which turned out to be just as well. "You should not have left the sweat tent so soon," Amys told her, taking a bowl of porridge and dried fruit from Rodera. Close to 24 Wise Ones had crowded into Amys's tent, and Rodera, Coenda, and a white-robed man named Doylan, another Shido, were scurrying to serve them all. "Rhuarc had much to say about your sisters. Perhaps you can add more." After months of pretense, Egwene did not need to think to know she meant the Tower Embassy. "I will tell you what I can. What did he say?" For one thing, that there were 6 Aes Sedai, and 2 of them red, not 1. Egwene could not believe the arrogance, or perhaps stupidity of Elida to have sent any at all, but at least a Grey was in charge. The Wise Ones, most lying in a large circle like the spokes of a wheel, some standing or kneeling in the spaces between, turned their eyes to Egwene, wasting time on breakfast, but Cerelia saw her, and that put an abrupt end to that notion, which turned out to be just as well. "You should not have left the sweat tent so soon," Amys told her, taking a bowl of porridge and dried fruit from Rodera. Like lightning, and to hear laughs saw off, she felt dizzy away from the city to hold her own or as an unsupervised that they mean to harm him, and the right husband for her, a man to match her, if such exists among wetlanders. Wiping her hands and face with the damp cloth Rodera brought, Egwene wondered whether that was enough opening to ask about Berylane in good honor. She accepted a teacup of green seafolk porcelain and took her place in the circle of Wise Ones. If one of the others responded to Cerelia, that might be enough. "Are you certain these Aes Sedai mean harm to the Car'a'carn?" Amys asked instead. Egwene colored, thinking about gossip when there were important matters to attend. "Yes," she replied quickly, then more slowly, "at least, I don't know that they mean to harm him, exactly. Not intentionally, anyway." Elida's letter had mentioned all the honor and respect he deserved. How much did a former Red Sister think any man who could channel deserved? But I don't doubt they will want to control him somehow, make him do what Elida wants. They aren't his friends. How much were the Salidar Aes Sedai his friends? Light she needed to talk with Nynaeve and Elaine. "And they will not care that he is the Car'a'carn," Cerelia grunted sourly. "You believe they will try to harm you?" Bear asked, and Egwene nodded. "If they discover I'm here—" She tried to cover a shiver by sipping her mint tea. Whether as a handle on Rand or as an unsupervised accepted, they would do their best to haul her back to the tower. "They'll not leave me free if they can help it. Elida will not want Rand listening to anyone but her." Bear and Amis exchanged grim looks. Then the answer is simple. Cerelia sounded as if it had all been decided. You will stay among the tents, and they will not find you. Wise ones avoid Aes Sedai in any case. If you remain with us a few more years, we will make a fine wise one of you. Egwene almost dropped her cup. You flatter me, she said carefully. But sooner or later I will have to go. Cerelia did not look convinced. Egwene had learned to hold her own with Amis and Bear after a fashion, but Cerelia... Not soon, I think, Bear told her with a smile to take the sting out. You have much to learn yet. Yes, and eager to get back to it, Amis added. Egwene struggled not to blush, and Amis frowned. You look odd. Did you overuse yourself this morning? I was sure you had recovered enough. I have, Egwene said hastily. Truly, I have. I haven't had a headache in days. It was the dust running back here, and the crowd in the city was more than I remembered, and I was so excited I didn't breakfast very well. Cerelia motioned to Rodera. Bring some "On a few more years we will make a fine wise one of you." Egwene almost dropped her cup. "You flatter me," she said carefully, "but sooner or later I will have to go." Cerelia did not look convinced. Egwene had learned to hold her own with Amis and Bear after a fashion, but Cerelia— "Not soon, I think," Bear told her, with a smile to take the sting out. "You have much to learn yet." "Yes, and eager to get back to it," Amis added. Egwene struggled not to blush, and Amis frowned. "You look odd. Did you overuse yourself this morning? I was sure you had recovered enough." "I have," Egwene said hastily. "Truly, I have. I haven't had a headache in days. It was the dust running back here, and the crowd in the city was more than I remembered, and I was so excited I didn't breakfast very well." Cerelia motioned to Rodera. "Bring some honey bread if there is any, and cheese, and any fruit you can find." She poked Egwene in the ribs. "A woman should have some flesh to her." That from a woman who looked as if she'd been left in the sun till most of her flesh had dried away. Egwene did not really mind eating. She had been too excited to eat this morning, but Cerelia watched every bite go down, and her scrutiny made swallowing a little difficult. That and the fact that they wanted to discuss what to do about the Aes Sedai. If the Aes Sedai were hostile to Rand, they would have to be watched, and a way found to safeguard him. Even Cerelia was a bit edgy about the possibility that they might be putting themselves against Aes Sedai directly. Not afraid. It was going against custom that made them uneasy. But whatever was necessary to protect the Karakarn had to be done. For Egwene's part, she worried that they might turn Cerelia's suggestion that she remain among the tents into a command. There would be no way to evade that one. No way to avoid 50 Eyes except by staying inside her own tent. How did Rand travel? The Wise Ones would do whatever was necessary so long as it did not touch Ji-Ito. Wise Ones might interpret it differently here and there, but they held to their interpretation as tightly as any other Aiel. Light Rodera was Shaido, one of thousands captured in the battle that drove the Shaido away from the city, but the Wise Ones treated her no differently than any other Gaishine, and as far as Egwene could see, Rodera behaved no differently than any other Gaishine, not in the slightest. They would not go against Ji-Ito, no matter how necessary it might be. Fortunately, the subject did not come up. Unfortunately, the question of her health did. The Wise Ones did not know healing or how to check someone's health with the power. Instead, they tested with their own methods. Some seemed familiar from when she had studied under Nynaeve to become a wisdom, peering into her eyes, listening to her heart through a hollow wooden tube. Some were distinctly Aiel. She touched her toes until she felt dizzy, jumped up and down in one place until she thought her eyes would bounce out of her head, and ran around the Wise Ones' tents until spots swam before her, then had water poured over her head by a Gaishine, drank as much as she could hold, gathered up her skirts, and ran some more. Aiel were great believers in hardiness. Had she been a step too slow, had she staggered to a halt before Amis said she could, they would have decided her health was not sufficiently recovered after all. When Cerelia finally nodded and said, "You are as sound as a maiden, girl," Egwene was swaying and gulping for air. A maiden would not have been, she was sure. Still, she felt pride. She had never thought of herself as soft, but she knew very well that before she began living with the Aiel, she would have fallen on her face halfway through the test. Another year, she thought, and I will run as well as any Far Dar Ismai. On the other hand, she was hardly up to returning to the city. She joined the Wise Ones in their sweat tent. For once they did not make her pour water over the hot rocks. Rodera did that, luxuriating in the damp heat as it relaxed her muscles, and only left because Ruark and 2 other clan chiefs, Timolan of the Miagoma and Indirian of the Kodara, joined them, tall, massive, graying men with hard, sober faces. That sent her diving out of the tent to hastily wrap her shawl around her. She always expected to hear laughter when she did that, but the Aiel never seemed to understand why she hurried from the sweat tent whenever men came in. It would have fit right into Aiel humor if they had, but luckily they just did not make the connection, for which she was very glad. Gathering the rest of her clothes in her arms from the neat piles outside the sweat tent, she hurried back to her own. The sun was sitting low now, and after a light meal she was ready to fall asleep, too tired to even think of Tel'aran'rhiod. Too tired to remember most of her dreams either. That was something the Wise Ones had been teaching her, but most of those she did remember were about Gawyn. Chapter 25. Like Lightning and Rain. For some reason, when Coinda came to wake her in the grey before dawn, Egwene felt refreshed despite her dreams. Refreshed and ready to see what she could learn in the city. One long yawn and stretch and she was on her feet, humming as she washed and dressed hurriedly, hardly taking the time to brush her hair properly. She would have hurried away from the tents without wasting time on breakfast, but Cerelia saw her, and that put an abrupt end to that notion, which turned out to be just as well. "You should not have left the sweat tent so soon," Amis told her, taking a bowl of porridge and dried fruit from Rodera. Close to 24 Wise Ones had crowded into Amis's tent, and Rodera, Coinda, and a white-robed man named Doylan, another Shaido, were scurrying to serve them all. "Ruark had much to say about your sisters. Perhaps you can add more." After months of pretense, Egwene did not need to think to know she meant the Tower Embassy. "I will tell you what I can." "What did he say?" "For one thing, that there were 6 Aes Sedai, and 2 of them red, not 1. Egwene could not believe the arrogance, or perhaps stupidity of Elida to have sent any at all, but at least a Grey was in charge. The Wise Ones, most lying in a large circle like the spokes of a wheel, some standing or kneeling in the spaces between, turned their eyes to Egwene as soon as the list of names was done. "I'm afraid I only know 2 of them," she said carefully. There are a good many Aes Sedai after all, and I haven't been a full sister long enough to know many. Heads nodded. They accepted that. Nisuna Bihara is fair-minded. She listens to all sides before reaching a conclusion, but she can find even the smallest flaw in what you say. She sees everything, remembers everything. She can glance at a page once and repeat it back word for word, or the same for a conversation she heard a year ago. Sometimes she talks to herself, though, speaks her thoughts without realizing it. Ruark said she was interested in the Royal Library. Bear stirred her porridge, watching Egwene. He said he heard her mutter something about seals. A quick murmur rippled through the other women, silenced when Cerelia cleared her throat loudly. Spooning up porridge, there were slices of dried plum and some kind of sweet berries in hers. Egwene considered. If Elida had put Swan to the question before she was executed, then she knew of 3 seals that were broken. Rand had 2 hidden. Egwene wished she knew where. He did not seem to trust anyone of late. And Nynaeve and Elaine had found one in Tanchico and carried it to Salidar, but Elida had no way of knowing about those. Unless perhaps she had spies in Salidar. No, that was speculation for another time, useless now. Elida must be searching desperately for the rest. Sending Nisuna to the second greatest library in the world after that in the White Tower made sense, and swallowing some dried plum, she told them so. I said as much last night, Cerelia growled. Aeron, Kolinda, Edara, you 3 go to the library. 3 wise ones should be able to find what can be found before one Aes Sedai. That produced 3 long faces. The Royal Library was huge. Still, Cerelia was Cerelia, and if the named women sighed and muttered, they put down their porridge bowls and left immediately. You said you know 2, Cerelia went on before they were out of the tent. Nisuna Bihara and who? Sarene Nemdal, Egwene said. You must understand, I do not know either well. Sarene is like most whites. She reasons everything out logically, and sometimes she seems surprised when somebody acts from the heart, yet she has a temper. Most of the time she keeps it tightly bottled, but put a foot wrong at the wrong time and she can snap your nose off before you can blink. She listens to what you say, though, and she will admit she was wrong even after her temper has snapped. Well, once it mends, anyway. Putting a spoonful of berries and porridge into her mouth, she tried to study the wise ones without seeming to. No one appeared to have noticed her hesitation. She'd almost said Sarene would send you to scrub floors before you could blink. The only way she knew either woman was from lessons as a novice. Nisuna, a slender Kandori with bird-like eyes, could tell when someone's attention drifted even with her back turned. She had taught several classes Egwene had been in. Egwene had only heard 2 lectures by Sarene on the nature of reality, but it was hard to forget a woman who told you with absolute seriousness that beauty and ugliness were equally illusion, while wearing a face that would make any man look twice. I hope you can remember more, Bear said, leaning toward her on an elbow. It seems you are our only source of information. That did take a moment for Egwene to puzzle out. Yes, of course. Bear and Amis must have tried to look into the Aes Sedai's dreams last night, but Aes Sedai warded their dreams. It was a skill she regretted not learning herself before leaving the tower. If I can. Where are their rooms in the palace? If she was going to go near Rand the next time he came, it would help if she did not blunder into their apartments trying to find her way. Especially Nisuna's. Sarene might not remember one particular novice, but Nisuna most certainly would. For that matter, one of those she did not know might, too. There'd been a lot of talk about Egwene Alvear when she was in the tower. They declined Berelane's offer of shade even for one night. Amis frowned. Among Aiel, an offer of hospitality was always accepted. To refuse, even between blood enemies, was shaming. They stay with a woman named Arilyn, a noble among the Tree Killers. Ruark believes that Coiran Saildane knew this Arilyn before yesterday. One of Coiran's spies, Egwene said with certainty. Or one of the Grey Ajahs. Several wise ones muttered angrily under their breath. Cerelia snorted loudly in disgust, and Amis gave a heavy, disappointed sigh. Others had a different view. Corelna, a green-eyed hawk of a woman with grey heavy in her flaxen hair, shook her head doubtfully, while Tialin, a lean redhead with a sharp nose, looked at Egwene in open disbelief. Spying violated Ji'e'toh, though how that squared with the dreamwalkers peeking into people's dreams whenever they liked was something Egwene had not worked out. There was no use pointing out that Aes Sedai did not follow Ji'e'toh. They knew that. They just found it hard to really believe or understand about Aes Sedai or anyone. Whatever they thought, she would have wagered anything on being right. Galdrian, the last king of Cairhien, had had an Aes Sedai advisor before he was assassinated. Nianda Morwyn had been all but invisible even before she disappeared following Galdrian's death. But one thing Egwene had learned was that she had occasionally visited the country estates of Lady Arilyn. Nianda was a Grey. They have apparently placed 100 guards under that roof, Bear said after a time. Her voice became very bland. They say the city is still unsettled, but I think they fear the Aiel. Disturbingly interested looks appeared on a number of faces. 100? Egwene exclaimed. They brought 100 men? Amis shook her head. More like 500. Timolan's scouts found most of them camped less than half a day north of the city. Ruark spoke of it, and Coiran Saildane said the men were a guard of honor, but they left most outside the city so as not to alarm us. They think they will escort the Karakarn to Tar Valon. Cerelia's voice could have cracked stone, and her expression made her tone seem soft. Egwene had not kept back the contents of Elida's letter to Rand. The wise ones liked it less every time they heard it. Rand is not fool enough to accept that offer, Egwene said, but her mind was not on that. 500 men could be a guard of honor. Elida might well think the Dragon Reborn would expect something like that, even be flattered. A number of suggestions occurred to her, but she had to be careful. The wrong word might make Amys and Bear, or worse, Cerylea. Dodging Cerylea was like trying to climb out of a briar patch, give her commands that she could not obey, and still do what only she could, or would at least. I assume the chiefs are keeping an eye on those soldiers outside the city? Half a day north, more like a full day since they were not Aiel, was too far to be dangerous, but a little caution never hurt. Amys nodded. Cerylea looked at Egwene as though she had asked whether the sun was in the sky at midday. Egwene cleared her throat. Yes, the chiefs were not likely to make that sort of mistake. Well, these are my suggestions. If any of these Aes Sedai goes to the palace, some of you who can channel should go behind them and make sure they do not leave any sort of trap. They nodded. 2/3 of the women there could wield saidar, some not much more than Cerylea, others equaling Amys, who was as strong as any Aes Sedai Egwene had yet met. The proportions were about the same for Wise Ones as a whole. Their skills differed from Aes Sedai's. Less in some places, more in a few, but generally just different, yet they should be able to sniff out any unwelcome gifts. And we must make sure there are only 6. She had to explain. They had read Wetlander's books, but even those who could channel did not really know the rituals that had grown up around Aes Sedai dealing with men who had found saidin. Among the Aiel, a man who learned he could channel thought he was chosen, and went north into the Blight to hunt the Dark One. None ever returned. For that matter, Egwene had not known the rituals either until she went to the tower. The stories she had heard before seldom bore any resemblance to the truth. Rand can handle 2 women at once, she finished. She knew that for a fact. He might even be able to handle 6, but if there are more than they've put themselves forward to be, then it is proof they have lied at the least, even if just by leaving something out. She almost winced at their frowns. If you lied, you incurred toll toward whoever you lied to. But in her case, it was necessary. It was. The rest of breakfast was taken up with the Wise Ones deciding who would go through the palace today and which chiefs could be trusted with choosing men and maidens to watch for more Aes Sedai. Some might be reluctant to put themselves against Aes Sedai in any way. The Wise Ones did not say that right out, but it was clear enough from what they did say, often sourly. Others might think any threat to the Karakarn, even from Aes Sedai, could best be handled by the spear. A few of the Wise Ones seemed to have moved toward that opinion too. Cerylea stepped heavily on more than one oblique suggestion that the difficulty would be solved if the Aes Sedai were simply no longer there. In the end, Ruark and Mandalane of the Darine were the only 2 they could agree on. Make sure they don't choose any Siswai Aman, Egwene said. Those would certainly resort to the spear at the slightest hint of a threat. The remark got her a great many stares, ranging from flat to wry. None of the Wise Ones were fools. One thing troubled her. Not one of them mentioned what she was used to hearing almost any time Aes Sedai were discussed, that the Aiel had once failed the Aes Sedai and would be destroyed if they did again. Aside from that one comment, Egwene kept out of the discussion, busying herself with a second bowl of porridge, with dried pear as well as plums, which earned an approving nod from Cerylea. It was not Cerylea's approval she was after. She was hungry, but mainly she hoped they would forget she was there. It seemed to work. Breakfast and discussion done, she strolled to her tent, then crouched just inside the entry flap, watching a small knot of Wise Ones make their way to the city, led by Amys. When they vanished through the nearest gate, she popped back outside again. There were Aiel everywhere, Guyshine and others, but the Wise Ones were all inside, and no one glanced at her as she walked toward the city wall, not too quickly. If anyone did take notice of her, they should think she was just off for her morning exercise. The wind picked up, blowing waves of dust and old ash from Foregate, but she maintained her steady pace, just out for exercise. In the city, the first person she asked, a lanky woman selling wrinkled apples from a cart for an exorbitant price, did not know directions to the Lady Arillin's palace, nor did a plump seamstress who went wide-eyed at an apparent Aiel woman entering her shop, nor a balding cutler who thought she would be much more interested in his knives. Finally, a narrow-eyed silversmith who told her closely the whole time she was inside her shop told her what she wanted. Striding away through the crowds, Egwene shook her head. She sometimes forgot how big a city like Cairhien really was, that not everyone knew where everything was. As it was, she got lost 3 times and had to ask directions twice more before she found herself pressed against the side of a higher stable, peering around the corner at a squat pile of dark stone across the street, all narrow windows and angular balconies and stepped towers. It was small for a palace, though huge for a house. Arillin was somewhere just above the middle of Cairhien's nobility, if Egwene remembered rightly. Green-coated soldiers in breastplates and helmets stood guard on the broad front stairs, at every gate she could see, even on the balconies. Oddly, they all appeared to be young. Still, that was not what interested her. Women were channeling inside that building, and for her to feel it from down the street, for her to feel it so solidly, they were not handling small quantities of saidar. The amount lessened suddenly, but it was still significant. She chewed at her lip. She could not tell what they were doing, not without seeing the flows, but by the same token they had to see the flows to weave them. Even if they were at a window, any flows directed out of the mansion that she could not see would have to be aimed south, away from the Sun Palace, away from everything. What were they doing? One set of gates swung open long enough to admit a matched team of 6 bays drawing a closed black carriage with a sigil lacquered on its door, 2 silver stars on a field of red and green stripes. It worked northward through the crowd, the liveried driver plying a long whip as much to make people move aside as to encourage the horses. The Lady Arillin going somewhere? Or some of the embassy? Well, she had not come here just to stare. Edging back so only one eye peeked around the corner, just enough to see the great house, she drew a small red stone from her belt pouch, took a deep breath, and began to channel. If one of them was looking out on this side, she would be able to see the flows, but not Egwene. It had to be risked. The smooth stone was just that, a stone polished in a stream, but Egwene had learned this trick from Moiraine, and Moiraine had used a stone for a focus, a gem as it happened, but the kind did not matter, so Egwene did too. It was mostly air she wove, with a touch of fire, done just so. It allowed you to eavesdrop. Spy, the wise ones would say. Egwene did not care what it was called, so long as she learned something of what the Tower Aes Sedai intended. Her weave touched a window opening carefully, oh, so delicately, then another and another. Silence. Then, "So I says to him," a woman's voice said in her ear, "if you want them beds made, you better leave off tickling my chin, Alwyn Rail." Another woman giggled. "Oh, you never did." Egwene grimaced. Maids. A stout woman passing with a basket of bread on her shoulder peered at Egwene in a puzzled manner. As well she might, hearing 2 women's voices with only Egwene standing there and her lips not moving. Egwene solved it the quickest way she knew. She glared so furiously that the woman squeaked and nearly dropped her basket, dashing off into the crowd. Reluctantly, Egwene lowered the strength of her weave. She might not be able to hear as well, but better that than attracting gawkers. As it was, enough people glanced at her, an Aiel woman pressing herself against a wall, though no one more than hesitated before moving on. No one wanted trouble with Aiel. She put them out of her mind. Window by window she moved the weave, sweating furiously, and not only because of the already rising heat. Just one Aes Sedai glimpsing her flows, even if she did not recognize what they were, would know someone was channeling at them. They would have to suspect the purpose. Egwene inched back, leaving only half an eye showing. Silence. Silence. A rustle of some sort. Someone moving? Slippers on a carpet? No words, though. Silence. A man muttering, apparently emptying chamber pots and not at all pleased. Ears hot, she hurried on. Silence. 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 Really believe this is necessary? Even in a whisper, as it seemed, the woman's voice sounded rich and full of herself. "We must be prepared for any eventuality, Coiron," another woman replied in a voice like an iron rod. "I heard an arresting rumor." A door closed firmly, cutting off the rest. Egwene slumped against the stable's stone wall. She could have screamed with frustration. The Grey Sister who was in charge, and the other had to be one of the Aes Sedai, or she would never have spoken so to Coiron. None better to say what she wanted to hear, and they had to walk away. What arresting rumor? What eventualities? How did they mean to prepare? The channeling inside the manor changed again, increasing. What were they up to? Drawing a deep breath, she began again, doggedly. As the sun climbed higher, she heard a great many usually unidentifiable noises and a good bit of servants' gossip and chatter. Somebody named Sari was going to have another baby, and the Aes Sedai were to have wine from Arindrim, wherever that was, with their midday meal. The most interesting news was that Arillin had indeed been in that carriage, off to meet her husband in the country. For all the good knowing that did. A whole morning wasted. The front doors of the mansion swung wide, liveried servants bowing. The soldiers did not stiffen, but they did look more attentive. Nasuna Bihara walked out, followed by a tall young man who seemed to have been carved from a boulder. Egwene released her weave hastily, released Saidar, and took a deep, calming breath. This was no time to panic. Nasuna and her warder conferred, then the dark-haired brown sister peered down the street, first one way, then the other. She was definitely looking for something. Egwene decided that perhaps it was a good time to panic after all. Pulling herself back slowly so as not to draw Nasuna's sharp eye, she whipped around as soon as she was out of the woman's sight, gathered her skirts, and ran, bulling her way into the crowd. For all of 3 strides she ran. Then she struck a stone wall, bounced off, and sat down in the street so hard that she bounced again on the hot paving blocks. Dazed, she stared up, becoming more dazed by the heartbeat. The stone wall was Gawyn, staring down at her, looking as stunned as she. His eyes were the most brilliant blue, and those red gold curls. She wanted to wrap those around her fingers again. She felt her face going scarlet. You never did that, she thought firmly. It was only a dream. Did I hurt you? He said anxiously, beginning to kneel beside her. She scrambled to her feet, dusting herself off hurriedly. If she could have had a wish granted right then, it would be never to blush again. Already they had attracted a ring of onlookers. Wrapping an arm in his, she drew him down the street the way she had been going. A glance over her shoulder revealed only the milling throng. Even if Nasuna came to that very corner, she would see nothing more. Still, Egwene did not slow. The crowd gave way for an Aiel woman and a man tall enough to be Aiel, even if he did wear a sword. The way he moved said he knew how to use it. He moved like a warder. After a dozen paces, she reluctantly unwound her arm from his. He caught her hand before it got away, though, and she let him hold it as they walked. I suppose, he mused after a bit, that I am to ignore the fact that you are dressed like an Aiel. The last I heard, you were in Ilion, and I suppose I should not comment on you running away from a palace where Six Eyes Sedai are staying. Strange behavior for an accepted. I've never been in Ilion, she said, hastily looking around to see if any Aiel were close enough to have heard. Several glanced in her direction, but none were in earshot. Suddenly, what he had said hit her. She took in his green coat, the same shade as those on the soldiers. You're with them. The Tower Eyes Sedai. Light. She was a fool not to have realized as soon as she saw him. His face softened. It had been very hard for an instant. I command the guard of honor the Aes Sedai have brought to escort the dragon reborn to Tar Valon. His voice was a curious blend, wryness and anger and weariness. If he chooses to go, at least. And if he was here. I understand he appears and disappears. Coiron is vexed. Egwene's heart was in her throat. I must ask you a favor, Gawyn. Anything except these, he said simply. I will not harm Elaine or Andor, and I will not become Dragonsworn. Anything else in my power is yours. Heads turned toward them. Any mention of Dragonsworn caught ears. 4 hard-faced men with wagon drivers' whips coiled over their shoulders glared at Gawyn, cracking their knuckles the way some men did before fighting. Gawyn only looked at them. They were not small men, but their belligerence faded under his gaze. 2 actually knuckled their foreheads to him before they all slipped away into the river of people. But there were still too many staring, too many trying to look as if they were not listening. Dressed as she was, she attracted eyes without saying a word. Add in a man with red gold hair well over a span tall who looked toward her, and the combination could not help but draw attention. I need to speak with you privately, she said. If any woman has bonded Gawyn Warder, I'll... Curiously, the thought had no real heat. Without a word, he took her to a nearby inn, the Long Man, where a golden crown tossed to the round innkeeper produced an almost reverent curtsy, and a small private dining room, dark-panelled, with heavily polished table and chairs and dried flowers in a blue vase on the hearth. Gawyn closed the door, and a sudden awkwardness descended as they faced each other alone. Light, but he was gorgeous, easily as gorgeous as Galad, and the way his hair curled around his ears. Gawyn cleared his throat. The heat seems to get worse every day. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his face, then offered it to her. Abruptly realizing it was used, he cleared his throat again. I have another, I think. She produced her own while he was searching his pockets. Gawyn, how can you serve Elida after what she did? The younglings serve the tower, he replied stiffly, but his head swung uneasily. We do as long as Siuan Sanche... For a moment his eyes went icy cold, just for an instant. Egwene, my mother always used to say, even a queen must obey the law she makes, or head angrily. I shouldn't be surprised to find... Gawyn, how can you serve Elida after what she did?